All right, hello, Metal Maniacs. It's the Meista from Brews and Tunes. Cheers. Very, very excited today. I am chatting with the one and only legendary vocalist, as well as journalist as well, Mr. Howard Johnson, aka H, aka Hojo. How you doing?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much for being on. I'm really excited to be chatting with you.
Really, it's my pleasure.
So I guess first off, just want to right off the bat, let's talk about your band Dawn After Dark. After geez, almost 30 years, you guys got back together around what 2019, I think it was 2018, 2019.
Yeah, it's a crazy story, really, that the band came back together. Um, just for those who might not know our history, because obviously we're a UK band, not never visited the States, but in the mid to late 80s, Dawn After Dark was quite a well-known group on the UK rock circuit. We signed to an indie label in the UK called Chapter 22, and between 1988 and 1990 released three 12-inch singles, the third of which might interest your listeners and viewers in that it was produced by Stevie Young of AC/DC fame.
Oh, nice.
Uh, and then the band split in 1990 for the usual silly reasons of young men spending far too much time together. Um, and in 2019, out of the blue, a promoter phoned us up and asked if we'd be interested in putting the band back together. And to be frank with you, I hadn't had any intention of doing so at all. And then the opportunity to play in our hometown of Birmingham, home of metal, the home of Priest and Sabbath, was frankly too tempting to turn down. So we played a show there where the band was formed and was based in 2019, and to our great surprise, an awful lot of people turned out with old Dawn After Dark shirts that hadn't seen the light of day since the early 90s. And a great time was had. And as luck would have it, the owner of Chapter 22, our original label in the 80s, was very keen for us to record and to put out an album, which had been our intention in the first time around. And so in 2020, we recorded what became the New Dawn Rising album. Of course, that came out during the COVID period, so it was difficult, but it came out at the end of 2021. And since COVID restrictions have been relaxed, the band's been back and playing in the UK again. It's been a wild and crazy journey.
Very cool, very cool. It's so cool to see. And I know there's been a few bands that we've seen kind of similar stories, got back together after extended period of time. And but yeah, it's the album is such a joy to listen to. I've really enjoyed it over these past several months listening to it. And it's cool you re-recorded a few songs, or a couple songs, particularly Crystal High, which was, I don't know if it was the biggest hit from that the old time, the old era, but I know it was. I remember seeing the video on here in the States. I remember seeing the video. So
Wow, you've got a good memory.
well, not anymore. There's periods of time. But yeah, and just such great stuff. I really, really enjoyed it. I know it's interesting because back then and even now, I think you guys get compared to like the Cult or the Mission, but you have your own unique sound, and there's definitely some Cult-esque vibes, particularly I think with the kind of the driving guitar work, reminds me a little bit of Billy Duffy. And but I just, it's what I love about it is it's just straight ahead, rock and roll. It's just a joy to listen to.
Well, that's very kind of you, and I'm very pleased to hear it. I think you've hit the nail on the head. It would be pretty disingenuous of me to say that the Cult weren't an influence. Clearly, they were, but there were a lot of influences in the band. I think that the best way of describing Dawn After Dark is to say we believe that we're a heavy rock band who has listened to a lot of what you'd call the alternative scene in the 80s, and I'm very proud of that. I think that both the hard rock scene, when I first started getting interested in music from the early 80s, was a really vibrant scene. And then I think it kind of, after the LA hair metal thing came along, I kind of, lost a little interest in that. It wasn't really my bag. And I found that as a young guy in Britain, the really vibrant rock music was coming out of that alternative scene at the time. So bands like Killing Joke and The Cult and New Model Army. And I think that it was a natural evolution that the band would sound like a band that was a hard rock band at its core, but I'd listened to a lot of alternative music. And I hope that's what the album New Dawn Rising kind of portrays to people.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and what I love about it too is that it's it harkens back to that time, but it's not, some just nostalgic out. I mean, it's a modern, fresh sounding album too, which and of course, I knew a couple of the songs from way back, and I love that they've been re-recorded and had kind of have a fresher sound to them, and but yeah, just really hard hitting, like you said, just kind of feels like that rock and roll era of kind of that alternative rock vibe from that time of in England, which is really cool to hear.
It's an interesting thing because when we were young guys, when Dawn After Dark was happening first time around, we were all in our early 20s, and now of course we're all in our mid to late 50s. It's a lot of water's got under the bridge since then. But one of the things I think is really great about the fact that you can make music these days as older guys is that, number one, there's no agenda. We make the music that we love. We have no great ambition to be playing some kind of enormo dome at any time soon. That would be ridiculous. So the band comes from a very pure place. We make music that we love. We make music that we think stands up with anything that's out there. Obviously there's an awful lot of music that gets put out now because it's so much easier to record than it was back in the day. Right. So my belief is that you have to have pretty exacting standards because you're trying to cut through a lot of noise. And I think that we were very keen to be hard on ourselves and make sure that the music was of really high quality. And I think that, the reviews that the album has had and the reception that we've had from people who've heard it is that it is what you might call an undiscovered gem.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a good description. I loved, there was an old interview from the late 80s that you did. I think it was with Monsters of Rock. And I loved your description of the interviewer asked you, what your thoughts were of the band in terms of the sound. And I thought it just wrapped it up perfectly. You said, we're rock with a capital R. And I'm like, that nails it right on the head. I think that's a great description of what Dawn After Dark is.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of a little old school in that when I first started getting interested in rock music, there weren't all the subdivisions that exist now. If you like rock, you kind of felt part of a gang and felt part of an exclusive club. And when I used to go to gigs in Manchester, where I grew up in kind of 79, 80, around about that time, you'd see the old classic denim jackets that the kids wore. And it wasn't weird to see a guy with Motorhead patches, April Wine patches, REO Speedwagon patches, and Judas Priest patches. It wasn't this kind of this divide. If you like rock music, because there was so few outlets in the UK for people to hear that kind of music, and it really didn't it didn't get played on radio. Kerrang didn't exist in 1980, so therefore you felt part of a club, and it was like I said at the time, rock with a capital R. It wasn't about subdivisions. And in many ways, I kind of like the fact that, there's a cross-pollination and you can appreciate and listen to all good rock music. And I guess that flowed into my appreciation of alternative music as I got older, in that I wasn't closed-minded. I didn't just want to be part of one thing.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And yeah, I agree. I, being in my 50s as well, it was, kind of the same for me here in the States was, just, especially that time in the late 70s, early 80s was, yeah, I just listened to heavy music that, I didn't pigeonhole, yeah, like you said, there weren't all these subgenres and subgenres now, and
Yeah,
um, which is nice because I think, yeah, it gets a little, that my wife always calls it she says I don't play the genre game, just
yeah.
for the music.
So
Yeah.
I'm with your wife. I'm not playing the genre game either.
I want to circle back. You mentioned Kerrang magazine, and of course, you wrote for Kerrang for a number of years. So I was curious about that transition as a writer into a musician. Did you always have kind of musical ambition in terms of wanting to form a band, or kind of what was that path? What was that journey for you?
Yeah, I mean it is an interesting story in that there were one or two writers from the UK rock press who dabbled in bands, but there seemed to be a little bit of a negative connotation to that in the UK back in the day. And somehow it wasn't kind of credible for people who were critiquing records to also want to make music. And to a certain degree, I can understand why that would be the case. I can understand how some people would go, why the hell would some guy, who's spends his life critiquing other bands suddenly want us to, be nice about his? Uh, so I kind of get that. But then again, it would also be a natural evolution in some ways. If you really love music,
Hmm.
I think there's a drive to want to create your own and to want to be part of that um, that 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 world of people who are creative people. I enjoyed being a writer, and I wrote for Kerrang for a long time, for 10 years. Um, and I've never really stopped writing. It's a part of my creative world that I enjoy, but it didn't seem such a weird leap to want to make music because I love music so much. And I guess that's what drew me towards wanting to be in a band and and to try and be creative. It certainly wasn't about, oh, I've seen Motley Crue and I see how many girls turn up to their shows and I'd like a piece of that. It very much wasn't that. It was very much about wanting to make music and doing it for the love of music. And I think that I was probably naive and a little bit stupid in that I tried quite hard to keep the two things separate. And so I didn't really use my name that I had as a writer on Kerrang magazine to try and advance Dawn After Dark, which frankly is pretty idiotic. So when I look back on it now, I would have played it very, very differently, knowing what I know now. But that was the way it was. So I started writing for Kerrang in 1981, and Dawn After Dark came together around 1986. So there was kind of 5 years of a gestation period of wanting to do it. And frankly, I'm not a talented player. So the only way I was going to be in a band was to be a vocalist. Unfortunately, I had what seems to be a voice that had some appeal.
Yeah, yeah. Did you like prior to that, did you sing in a choir? Did you, as a kid, did you come from a musical family?
Nothing. No music in my family. No singing in choirs. No singing in church. Nothing. So. Dawn After Dark was my first band, and really the only band I've ever been in. It's no, if you're allowed to have a 30-year sabbatical, you could call it my life's work.
Nice, very good. So as far as the band, the formation of the band, were they mates of yours? How did that come about?
No, I mean the way the band came together was absolutely typical of how bands formed in the UK in the 80s. There was a weekly music newspaper called The Melody Maker, which was the place where all people who were searching for musicians would put their classifieds ads in the back. I mean, it sounds incredible now, doesn't it? Because of social media, the idea that there would be a printed paper where everybody would send a little advert in to try and find musicians.
Yeah.
But that was where all musicians used to put adverts, from the smallest bedroom bands to the biggest, rock bands on the circuit. I remember, when Iron Maiden were looking for new people, they would advertise in the Melody Maker. Wow. So that was the place. That was the place to go. And I saw an advert from two young guys in Birmingham, where I was living at the time, and they were looking for a singer for a band that I seem to remember they kind of went influences, Led Zeppelin, Death Cult, Killing Joke. I think that was it. And I just decided to try my hand, and I ended up going to an audition in what was an extremely metal part of town. It was where all the heavy industry was, and the three guys, there was a drummer, a bass player, and a guitar player, who had a tiny little space. You couldn't call it a rehearsal room. It was a space in the corner of a factory. And that's where they rehearsed. And I went in there, and we played Flower in the Desert by The Cult was one of the songs that we did. I think there was a New Model Army song. I think a Zeppelin song that I fail to remember now, but that was how it started. So it was nothing to do with my work on Kerrang, nor any kind of reputation I might have had as a writer. It was started out like so many bands do. People with a passion for music, wanting to create something.
That's cool. That's really amazing. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, you mentioned like Melody Maker, and I, yeah, you hear about these, like you said, big bands like Iron Maiden, Metallica, obviously not Melody Maker, but they advertised in the local paper in California at the time, and yeah, just crazy to think these, just post an ad and and then
Well, it's kind of weird, isn't it? Because I guess the drawdown you get from that is everybody starts somewhere. Every single band has started off with that kind of desire to make music, no money in their pockets, just a belief that against all odds you'll get somewhere. And of course, Dawn After Dark is a very, very long way from being Metallica, but within our little world we achieved something. And we put records out, and we toured, and we made music that we were very passionate about. And that's kind of even more amplified today, because we're in a fortunate position in many ways that we are impervious to all the difficulties that people know about that are part of the music industry today, and the incredible problems that professional bands have in being able to get out there and make it pay. There's clearly no revenue from record sales anymore. Live concerts are very difficult because the costs have just gone spiraled exponentially. American bands, particularly coming into Europe these days, are cancelling left, right, and centre because it just doesn't make financial sense for them anymore. And I feel in many ways very lucky in that Dawn After Dark is completely insulated from all that, because it's not our professional life. Although we think and believe that we write music and perform music at a very professional level, but this isn't how we make our livings. And that gives us a tremendous amount of freedom to be able to do exactly what we want to do. And we have a really understanding record company, Chapter 22, which incredibly is the same record label we had in the 80s, and they're still going, celebrating their 40th anniversary next year. And they are a really supportive label who work very hard to support bands like us, because they're passionate about the music and the bands that they sign, and they are set up in such a way as that you don't have to sell 50,000 albums to be able to be financially solvent for the record company to survive. And so a band like Dawn After Dark can operate on a sound financial footing, make the music that we want to make. We have a really supportive record company. We play great shows, and we don't have that, stress and pressure of going. I heard a story from one of the guys who runs Nuclear Blast, and unless they have 50,000 followers on social media, the record company won't even look at them. Yeah. So that's a stress. Yeah. We don't have that, and it means that we can really enjoy the work we do, and I think also it makes it such as that our music is completely pure. It's untainted by any commercial demands. We make the music we love, we make the music we believe in, and obviously we hope as many people as possible come along for the ride.
Nice, nice. Speaking of making the music, I was curious about the writing process. What is the writing process for you guys? Is it, somebody coming up with, kind of a whole package of songs, or is it more of a collaborative process in terms of like somebody coming up with riffs and then, you're writing lyrics, or, what is that process for you guys?
I mean, it was a really interesting process on the New Dawn Rising album, because we had 3 12-inch singles that were released on Chapter 22 in the late 80s. So there were 4, 5, 6, 10 songs that were recorded. So fans knew those songs, but there was a huge amount of stuff that had been written because we were pretty prolific writers. There were probably another 30 songs that had been created in some form or other. Some of them were pretty much finished. Some of them were skeletal ideas, but there were a lot of rehearsal tapes and little demo recordings that were around. So the writing process for the New Dawn Rising album was pretty weird, in that we were going back and kind of doing an archaeological dig around a lot of all the old stuff and going, what's good here, what isn't good, what stood the test of time, what now sounds dated. And then we would be pulling out either songs that were pretty much completed, or just segments or vocal melodies, and then trying to kind of figure out a way to contextualize them for the contemporary sound that we were looking for. So that was interesting. And also the fact that the way life is that not everybody's based in Birmingham anymore. I live in France. There's a lot of people dotted in all kinds of parts of the country. So there was a core of the rhythm section that would go and rehearse in Birmingham, because the rhythm guitarist and the drummer and the bass player were all based in the Midlands. And so the core of the songs would be worked out there. And then the guitarist and myself would either ping stuff down the lines or fly over and go into rehearsals. We like working in a room because we're old school. It's a perfectly legit and useful way of working to be able to ping stuff down the lines. Yeah. And it can work extremely well for people. And obviously in COVID, a lot of people, made use of that opportunity that the technology provides. We're just old school. We like being in a room together. And we like being able to work a song where you can have an instant rapport. So you go, oh, that drum fill doesn't seem to work, or that riff could go, slightly faster, or whatever it may be. But the ability to react instantly by being in a room together, I think, is exciting. And I think it particularly works with rock music. There are many other types of music that are out there that I think are probably not conducive to a bunch of people sitting in a room together. A lot of music that's made now is done via the technology that's available, via Pro Tools or whatever the technology is. And actually that works extremely well for that type of music. My belief is that a band like Dawn After Dark, which is, as I say, at its core is a traditional rock band. It's bass, drums, guitars and vocals. And I think that works well if you're in a room together bouncing ideas. It's not to say that it's everybody's way of doing it and that the other methods can't work extremely well for rock music. Just find that it works well for us.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it comes out too in there's a warmth to the record and I think you wouldn't have captured that if you were all separated, not actually playing together. And yeah, also the live, you have a really almost a live sound on that record too, which is great. I mean, it's it sounds like what you would hear in a club.
I think one of the interesting things about the recording process for the album was that obviously that there are some certain kind of realities that we have to deal with. We don't have a $100,000 recording budget, so we need to cut our cloth accordingly. But the great thing that has happened in the 30 odd years since we were recording first time around is that the technology allows you to reproduce good sounds so much more quickly and so much more efficiently than it used to be. I can remember, our second EP, which was called The Groove, we spent 5 days in a studio recording one song. And that wasn't unusual. Now the album was recorded in 5 days.
Wow.
The entire thing. It wasn't mixed in those 5 days, but the whole album was recorded in 5 days. And a lot of that is due to being very lucky to have a great producer and a guy called Andy Taylor, who was really, exceptionally good producer, understood our sound. But it's also that the technology now allows you to capture good guitar sounds, good bass sounds, good drum sounds in a way that really you couldn't do without, a lot of time, a lot of pain, and a lot of money a long time ago. I think that's a real boon for, for bands of our stature, is that we can produce records that, to my ears at least, sound as good as anything else that's out there.
Definitely. Yeah, it's a really, like I mentioned before, it has a really warm sound. It has a lot of depth to it. I think, yeah, very wonderfully recorded. Yeah, really well balanced. I that was one thing that struck me, was the production quality. I mean, just, killer rock and roll songs, but also just high production value to
That's, it's really nice of you to say so. And I think you're right, because one of the things that I particularly want to do when I make music is I want rock music that kind of has soul to it. And obviously I don't mean soul music, I mean soul and passion and feel. And I personally don't like a lot of those, kind of overly compressed rock records that you hear a lot. I think they take a little bit of the warmth away. And there may very well be, kind of commercial imperatives behind that, in that it's been proven maybe that type of sounding record is what appeals to, rock fans generally, or hard rock fans, or whatever. But that gets back to my point about, we love people who get excited by our music, but primarily we make the music the way we want to hear it. And I think that one of the things that sets us a little bit apart from some other bands is that we try to have a kind of a swing to the music. And I don't, obviously I don't mean like a jazz swing or anything like that, but it feels, I guess the easiest way of describing it is I try to make sure that when we write songs, it feels like you might want to dance to it. It's got a groove.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I like about the best rock music. It kind of has that vibe about it. It's not really my bag, the stuff that is, how would I describe it? It might be what you call a little bit kind of jarring in some of the tempo changes and some of the time changes that, a lot of rock bands are very technically proficient and they're extremely good at that sort of stuff. But I prefer to hear a band that can go out there and provide a groove. And I think that, you go right back to bands like Zeppelin, Free. I loved the fact that all those records sounded, like you say, warm, human. They had groove to them. And I think that's what I try to capture, and we try to capture as a band with Dawn After Dark, is to make something that feels human. And I think one of the interesting things that came out of that was when we were touring a lot in the 80s, and even now that we're back touring again and playing shows, is that we have a lot of women come to our shows. And I don't think that's coincidental, because it's certainly not because we're young and good looking or anything like that, that's for sure. But I think it's to do with the fact that there's something about the music that allows people to kind of dance to it.
Yeah. And it's just, your music, it's fun. It's just it's a fun album. It's very upbeat. It's very positive. And just, yeah, it's just a joy to listen to. And it's one of those albums, for me at least, that as soon as I get to the last song, as soon as I get to Truth and Freedom, I tend to start right back over again. It's like, I want more, so
well, I mean, it's obviously it thrills me to hear people, a long way from where I'm based, who've discovered the band and get a lot out of it. And then obviously I hope that a lot more people will go and listen to the album on whatever streaming platform they listen to, and will kind of feel that they've discovered a band that is perhaps unknown, but has an album, like I say, that can kind of, stand tall against, any of their favorite albums.
Yeah, definitely. Do you you mentioned that it sounds like you guys have kind of a trove of music from the past that you've written and probably going forward. Is there a plan for a follow-up album at this point?
Yeah, there absolutely is. The plans that we have at the moment are, there's going to be some 40th anniversary celebrations in the UK for for Chapter 22's birthday, for
Oh,
40
nice.
years of the record label. So there'll be some things going on for that we're going to do. Certainly some new recordings for that as part of that celebration. We are definitely going into a writing process now for a second album that will probably appear in 2025. We've been playing a reasonable amount of gigs in the UK with some of our friends, Balaam and the Angel, who I don't know again if it's a name that's known in the States, but they were part of the alternative scene in the UK. They had a deal with Virgin and toured in America with The Mission in kind of the late 80s.
Cool.
They're good friends of ours, and we do shows with them. We've been playing with Wolfsbane, who again you may well know from the Rick Rubin Deaf American years, because they were signed to Rick's label. A band, Theatre of Hate, which was again one of the top alternative bands in the UK at the time. So we've been doing a good number of shows with bands in the UK. And probably now the next phase is to go into a recording process. We've got kind of a mixed bag of ideas that are still held over from the 80s, which didn't make the first record, not because they weren't good enough, but because they were perhaps less formed. But also we've been into the rehearsal rooms fairly recently and started knocking out new ideas. So there are 4 or 5 new ideas that are in the process of being reworked, and we're really excited about just making another record. And again, being able to do it based on nothing but what music we get off on and get excited by. And I have to again say our record label Chapter 22, which I'm sure many people in America don't know about, but I would advise you to try and look them up if you don't know them. There's a lot of great music that they've released over the years. And they're just incredibly supportive of the band. They're very, very supportive of everything that we do. And it's just, it's a pleasure for us to be on that label.
Excellent. Very cool. Yeah, I'm very excited to hear the new material. So I guess I gotta wait a little while, but cannot wait to hear it. That's great. That's great news.
It's coming.
Very cool. Very cool. I was curious about in terms of your vocals, I was curious about your kind of, who are the, you mentioned a few bands that, like the Cult, obviously, and that influenced the band, but I was curious about you vocally, like who were kind of the big influences for you? Because I'm sure, especially as a writer, as a music journalist, I'm sure you have a lot of music come across your desk over the years. So it's kind of who were your big musical influences in terms of vocals?
There's a kind of it's a slightly weird answer to that question, because when I first started singing, I wasn't at all sure whether I could be a decent singer or not. I wasn't trained. I didn't have an 8-octave range. I just went in and did the best I could. And to be really honest with you, people who I grew up listening to, who I thought were incredible singers, the likes of Robert Plant and Paul Rodgers and David Coverdale, those kind of guys, they seemed so otherworldly in what they could do with their voices that I didn't even really, it wasn't part of my thinking when I started singing myself. I wanted to try and discover what my own voice was, because I guess I didn't think that I was good enough to mimic people. And I think that probably was a good thing, because it forced me to develop my own style. I think probably, part of the Cult influence of Dawn After Dark is down to the fact that I have the same vocal range as Ian Astbury, and B, I'm I'm from the same part of England as him as well. So I think there's perhaps something in the flat vowels that you get when you're from the northwest of England. He's from Liverpool, I'm from Manchester. I think some of that probably plays out in the sound of your voice. So I guess that I personally don't think I sound like Ian Astbury, but I think that people who listen to our records might go, okay, you know, there's something of the timbre of it. So, you know, that's a long way of answering the question, but it's pretty much to say that I didn't sit there listening to people when I was a fan of music and young going, I'd like to emulate those people, because I didn't think it was possible.
Yeah, interesting. I think there's a touch, and this is just my own personal opinion, but obviously, but I think there's a touch of Graham Bonnet in your vocal, in your delivery, at least with some of the songs. The first time I heard you way back, there was something about it where it just reminded me of, you know, not to say that you sound exactly like Graham Bonnet, but there was just something reminiscent, and I can't put my finger on it exactly, and maybe it's just your cadence. I don't know exactly what it is, but
well, nobody's ever said that to me before. But you know what's really interesting about that is Graham Bonnet is also from the same part of the world as myself and Astbury.
Oh, interesting. Yeah,
he's from that same part of the world. So maybe there's something in that.
Yeah, I heard it's funny you mentioned that. I heard a musician, a drummer, actually, a jazz musician, who's English. He has a podcast, and he was talking about how he thinks in a lot of ways, like modern music, and the reason a lot of modern music all sounds the same to some people, you know, to some degree, is that because music's become so global now, that we've lost some of that regional sound. So it's interesting that you mentioned, that you're from, you know, where Ian's from and where Graham Bonnet's from, and so these interesting elements that are, you know, kind of unique to that area, or at least vocally. That's
I mean, you know, I haven't heard a lot of singers discuss that as a kind of, you know, as a concept, the idea that, you know, certain ways in that when you're a kid and your vocal cords are being formed, and the sounds that you hear from all the people around you in the areas that you live in will necessarily have an influence on the way that your voice will develop and how you'll project yourself. But it seems quite logical to me that would be the case.
Yeah, that makes sense to me too. That's interesting. Something to think about some more. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
It's just a shame I didn't grow up near where Robert Plant grew up.
Yeah. Well, then you wouldn't sound like you do. So it's a good thing. It's a good thing. I was curious, you know, I definitely wanted to talk, you know, mostly about Dawn After Dark, but I also was curious about, you know, your past as a well, and current as an editor and a writer. But I was really curious about, I know at one point, and I don't really know any details about it, but I know you worked for Iron Maiden, correct?
Yes, I did. It was 1990, and I'd mentioned earlier that the band split around that time. You know, just the usual things, silly young men with silly fallings out about things that didn't need to, but that was the way it went. And I was 25 years old at the time, and I was really kind of thinking about what I wanted to do in my life, because I'd given 5 years of my life to Dawn After Dark, and it kind of, you know, it had all fallen apart, and I wasn't really sure that I wanted to go back to starting again. And suddenly going, okay, I could commit another 5 years to something. You don't get anywhere. You're 30 years old. You know, there are other things in life that you got to think about. Do you want to have family? Do you want to have buy a house? Do you know, all the things that everybody thinks about? And it just so happened at the time that I left the group was that when Rod Smallwood had asked me if I was interested in coming to work for Maiden, because I'd done a lot of work for Maiden when I was writing for Kerrang. I'd been on the road with them a lot. I was lucky enough to go behind the Iron Curtain with them in '84, which was that, you know, I think anyone who knows Iron Maiden is probably aware of that very influential tour that they did in Poland and Czech Republic, and at the time when, you know, it was very unusual for bands to be going to Eastern Bloc countries,
right?
And so I was pretty close to those guys and close to Rod as well, and he'd always said to me, you know, there's a job here for you if you want it. And I kind of, you know, I really was passionate about being in the band, and so it wasn't really the right time to do it. And then at that point I went, okay, this is the time to do it. So I went and I moved from Birmingham to London. I went to work for Rod, and the idea was that he was going to kind of train me up to be the next Rod, when he said, because he said, I'm not going to want to do this forever. And of course, now we know he was lying about that.
Yeah.
So I went down and I did 2 years working with Maiden, and I was super grateful to be able to work with them. Those guys are some of the most decent people you'll meet in bands. They were great to work for, but I found after 2 years it just wasn't me. I came to the conclusion that I was a creative person and not a management behind the scenes person. And I wanted to go back to writing and editing, and eventually back into making music again. So, it was a fantastic experience. I'll always be grateful to Rod for giving me that opportunity, and we're still in touch and we're still friends. But it wasn't really the right thing for me.
Gotcha. Understandable. Yeah, I was curious about that because, yeah, just kind of, it seems so different. I mean, apart from the musical industry, but being in part of the musical industry, it just was kind of a different path. It seemed from.
Yeah, I mean, it was very different, but it was kind of something that was. I hadn't gone looking for it. I was offered it, and I was very grateful for it. And frankly, had I found that was my niche, there wouldn't have been a better place to be, because the Maiden organisation is just a phenomenal organisation full of great people, and I would have been a lot richer today than I am now. But that wasn't to be, and I don't regret it, and I know that I made the right choice for me.
Nice. I mean, I know also you wrote a book about AC/DC a while back.
I did. A long time ago, actually, probably maybe 25 years ago, something like that. And it was called, rather tongue-in-cheekily, "Get Your Jumbo Jet Out of My Airport," which AC/DC fans will know why. And it was a kind of a weird mix of short pieces about obscurities, odd bits of kind of trivia about AC/DC and interviews with people who knew them and this and that. And also a little bit of my journey as a kind of, I hate the word journey, I should never use it. My story of being, my life, as how I got interested in rock music, because AC/DC was one of the very first bands that I fell in love with, and kind of how they mirrored my life through that period, that very early period, because I'm sure there's a million AC/DC fans who won't agree with me, but for me, the AC/DC that I love was that early period up until Back in Black in 1980, and really since then it's not really been what I consider to be the height of creative endeavor. I'm sure they'll be absolutely devastated to hear that with their multi-million record sales, but right. I'm just a fan of that period up to Back in Black. I thought AC/DC were just a phenomenal band who had all those characteristics that we talked about: warmth and humor and passion and rhythm and kind of swing to their music. And there was a time there, like kind of power age time, when I just thought they were unstoppable. And I think that that was probably one of the reasons why I decided to try and kind of mix those two things, kind of a personal story with a a fan's homage to a band that I really loved for a relatively short period of time. But that's that period is still a period I go back to. Still, I still have great affection for AC/DC, and of course, knowing Stevie as I did, because Stevie ran the rehearsal room where Dawn After Dark rehearsed in the 80s in Birmingham. So I actually knew Stevie pretty well, because he was there pretty much every day that we rehearsed. And he actually, while we were first time around rehearsing in that place in Birmingham, that was the time when Malcolm had to go and dry out, had some booze problems, and Stevie filled in on tour with them in '88, I think it was.
Oh, wow.
So while we were friends, friends is probably a little much, but we knew each other. And that was at the time when Stevie went off and filled in for Malcolm, and kind of a lot of people barely noticed the difference because he's so similar in stature and so similar in guitar playing style. And that was the time when he produced our 30p Maximum Overdrive. And so, AC/DC is kind of a little bit wrapped up in the history of Dawn After Dark as well.
That's really cool. That's really interesting. Yeah, I'm with you. I'm a huge Bon Scott fan. That's my favorite material. Same, and I like stuff they've done. In fact, I thought their last album, Power Up, was actually really good. But I'm with you. I love that early stuff. There's nothing like it. And at that time, it was kind of revolutionary in terms of, like, nobody sounded like that. There was nothing like that, really. Maybe
and what I really liked about them as well, I mean, I loved the sheer kind of, the ability to strip things down to what really mattered and the essentials of music, of rock music. And I really like that. And I also love the fact that Bon was just such a great lyricist and really funny and, insightful. He wrote words in a way that, most rock singers at that time really didn't do. If you think about a song like Shot Down in Flames, which is all about, kind of failing to attract a female, it was kind of like the opposite of all that kind of, thrusting machismo rock singing, which, I was never that comfortable with it. It's not me. I don't really, as you'll probably know from Dawn After Dark, there's nothing on, in Dawn After Dark's material that is kind of like, hey, baby, and,
right.
God. And, I was very pleased when the band came back together that I could go back to my old lyrics and our old sleeves, and there was nothing sexist in there. It was no girls in pants. And, that just was never my bag. And I kind of liked the fact that Bon, he was able to write things with a little bit of a wry, self-deprecating kind of tone. And I don't write lyrics in any way like Bon. My writing style is completely different, but I just really appreciated that, kind of ability to kind of be real.
Yeah, I agree. Nice. Do you have plans to write another book at any point? Have you thought about doing that? A different band, or?
It's a funny thing about writing. There are a lot of kind of rock journalist memoirs out there, and there are a lot of rock musician memoirs out there. I don't know how many, hybrids there are of people who've done both. Maybe that would be interesting. The real issue about writing books these days is, frankly, that the way that the publishing industry has changed is that, it's very difficult to write a book and be paid any proper money for doing it. Like the advances that publishers offer now are so small, it would have to be a passion project. And I think that there are maybe more appropriate ways of telling your story now than doing it in a book. I don't know if you're aware of things like Substack, which are social media channels via which journalists who have a reputation in their chosen field can communicate more directly with their audiences. And so, for example, if you were a columnist on the New York Times, say, now not so many columnists get the work at the New York Times because it's so expensive to pay people. So a lot of those guys who've built up an audience go on to Substack and start trying to communicate directly and build their own audience and offer the kind of, some free content and then a paywall whereby you can have a much more direct relationship with people who like your work, so that you could have you could have a podcast, you can have an Ask Me Anything kind of vibe. You could do, old stories about what it was like being on the road with bands, etc., etc. There's a lot of ideas that seem to me to work more appropriately in that kind of direct format, where you would ask people to pay you, a relatively small sum, $5 a month or whatever,
Right.
and then you would offer that kind of material that maybe 20 years ago you would have put into a book, that you would do, and try and develop, you know, a more personal relationship with people, so that they can talk to you and you can talk to them. And it's kind of, you know, to me, that's making more use of the mediums that we have to talk to people, and also to make that stuff more interesting. Because if I write a book, it's a flat, this is my opinion about everything. Whereas if you do it that way, you can have interaction with people and you can get feedback about what they thought, or they could ask you particular questions. Like we were talking about earlier, you know, my time on the road behind the Iron Curtain with Iron Maiden seems to me something that would be very, you know, to a certain number of people, that would be interesting. And to give them the opportunity to be able to talk to me directly about that and find out what it was really like, and get more than just reading the original story in Kerrang! Although obviously that would probably be part of my offering, because I've got all my archives of material. Yeah. So you could provide that, but make it more interactive. I think that probably is a more interesting way of talking about what I did back in the day, rather than just a book. So that's my thinking. I mean, whether that ever happens or not, I don't know. But you know, there's a lot of stuff that happened to me in those 10 years that I was working for Kerrang! That, you know, I'm sure people of our generation who grew up loving that magazine, and because it was so influential at the time, would probably enjoy reading and interacting with. So, yeah, you know, it's a thought in the back of my mind.
Cool.
It may
yeah, that would be fascinating. I know you have I remember reading Kerrang! Back in the day, and I've gone back and reread articles, you know, since. And yeah, I'm sure you have an amazing amount of stories, probably that have.
Yeah, and what's really interesting for me as well is that the interest for me is to be able to look at those old articles when I was, you know, I started writing for Kerrang! When I was 17 years old. And so, you know, I was a young guy. So I'm going to be reflecting the thoughts and feelings of a 17-year-old or an 18-year-old, you know, for those 10 years that I was doing it. And what's probably interesting is that I suspect people who might be, you know, interested in what I have to say or what I did will also be interested to go, okay, and how do we look at that from the perspective now, 40 years later? What, you know, what other things have I learned about those experiences I had? Because we're all different people now. And, you know, well, I hope that we're all different people, because, you know, one of the things that I don't really like in music is when I hear bands that don't progress. And maybe that's part of my AC/DC thing. I don't know, is that, you know, I feel as people grow older, people change, and music, if it's not a reflection of what you're going through as a person, I tend to lose interest, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and it's also nothing against the band, but it sometimes it seems a little silly, you know, when you know, it's one thing when, you know, a 20-something-year-old or even a 30-something-year-old is singing songs about chasing tail, you know, chasing women around. But, you know, when you're 65, 70 years old, it seems a little silly.
I think that's kind of, maybe those guys are still living that lifestyle. I suspect not. It feels somewhat dishonest, because that's not the life I'm leading. You know, I'm a guy who's been married for nearly 30 years, and, you know, I have children, and I've had life experiences, and many different things have happened. And I'd like to think that my creative work reflects all of that. Because if it's not, if it's just trying to, you know, kind of reinitiate a fantasy that maybe wasn't even true first time around, that feels dishonest to me.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, a little disingenuous. I was curious. I don't want to keep you all day, but the band, so Dawn After Dark. Do you guys have any for those watching, especially anybody in the UK? Do you guys have any shows coming up soon? Any can somebody?
Well, we just finished a string of dates with a band called Spear of Destiny, which was, again, as I say, one of those kind of, you know, well-known, well-loved alternative rock bands from the 80s. So we just finished some dates with them. We're now going into a writing phase. We'll probably be doing maybe half a dozen shows towards the end of the year. So the writing process will take priority. And, you know, the live arena these days, as I'm sure you'll know, is kind of, it's a difficult arena. There are a lot of people scrabbling around for not very much money in people's pockets. You know, inflation has gone through the roof. People don't have a lot of spare money around at the moment. It's hard for people to, you know, put their hand in their pockets to go and see lots and lots of different bands. So we are a little bit particular about the shows that we do, because we want the shows to be good and full and offering value for money to people. So and also we're not under any kind of pressure to be out there flogging our asses, you know, just for the sake of keeping the band solvent. Because, you know, of course, there's a load of people out there now who don't make any money from streaming anymore, so their only source of income is live shows and merch.
Yeah.
And I understand that, but that's not for us. I want to do good shows that are well attended, that we can offer something special. So you know, I suspect we'll do probably another half dozen shows through the year, but really our focus right now is kind of starting to think about another album.
Great. Excellent. Well, Howard, thank you so very much for chatting with me. It's been truly a pleasure and an honor talking with you today. For those watching, if you look in the description below, there are links to Dawn After Dark. If you've not heard them, definitely check them out. Heavy hitting rock and roll, just killer stuff. Yeah, so you can stream it. You can, you know, check out Chapter 22 Records. Also, the band's YouTube page has some pretty cool videos on there, as well as live footage, which is great. You know, especially for those of us in the States that probably won't have a chance of seeing you guys live anytime soon. Yeah, some great stuff on there to watch. So Howard, thank you so very much. Absolute pleasure.
Well, I have to say I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's been a real pleasure for me, and thank you for your interest. And as I say, you know, if people in the States are kind of motivated to go and listen to the band, it would be me who'd be honoured, and I'm sure you'll get something out of it if you like a classic rock and roll band.
Definitely. Thank you so much.